Welcome to the Myofascial Health Podcast, hosted by me, Unu. Follow along as I explore the depths of John Barnes' myofascial release approach on my road to mastery. Along the way, I'll be sharing the lessons I learn as I open my myofascial release practice in Austin, Texas, so that you don't have to make the same mistakes I do. Welcome back to the Myofascial Health Podcast. Now, I am joined here by a very special guest. He has been a physical therapist since 2002, so for 22 years. He started learning about myofascial release in 2005. He started his own myofascial release practice in 2010. And he even authored this book, Beyond Tape, in 2017. It's my honor to introduce Mike Gable. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. Really appreciate being here.
Now, you might not know this, but you played a pretty big part in my life of starting my own myofascial release practice geared around climbers. At the time, I was thinking about starting a practice, and what I had been told is, hey, you have to pick a niche. And I wanted to work with climbers, but when I looked around at different people in the industry, they were practitioners who had been climbing for 10 plus years. And I was like, man, I've only been climbing for 3 years. Who am I to say that I could work with climbers when everyone else is so built into their establishments? And one, that's a Channel 5 thought. I was comparing myself to others, and that kind of sucked the joy out of it. So if it's another reminder for all of us, is that comparison is a thief of joy. And not to compare yourselves, because everyone has their own gifts. And so while I was having this imposter syndrome, working with climbers and not feeling like I was really a climber that could help because I'd only been climbing for 3 years, I came across your book, Beyond Tape. And it really ran me down through all the common injuries that climbers get. And it allowed me to have confidence of, oh, I know how to treat these particular injuries. I've just never looked at them through a climbing context. So I just want to say thank you so much for writing this book. I don't know if you know the impact that it has, but it has served a huge impact in my own life.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And then I'll say this. I had met you in Key West, Florida, when
Yeah,
fascial cranium was a brand new seminar. I think it was the second time that it was taught. And I know
2019.
that when I was trying to learn about myofascial release, I had this Channel 5 thought of, if this is so great, then why aren't people just thriving with this? How come it's not more widespread? And I would take seminars and they'd be filled with, 100, 150 seminar participants. But when I went to fascial cranium at that seminar series in Key West, it was a zoo. I think there was like 400 or 500 different participants. There are tables lined up in the hallways. Oh my gosh. When I went there, I was like, oh, wow. It is here. It is very popular. I'm just new to the party. And so I was able to connect with you. And I think I had read your book or seen you post about your book. And I didn't know that you were there at the seminar. So it was really cool to connect with you. And I think we even traded on some of the techniques. And I kind of got to meet you in that seminar. And so can you talk us through how you got into myofascial release and leading up to maybe say that moment?
Yeah, so when I went to PT school, I didn't really know which avenue I wanted to take, and probably would have to do with athletes. And at the time, chronic pain was this thing where a lot of therapists and even professors were like, this is this whole other thing. You don't really want to get involved with that. It's a tricky deal. And thankfully, one of my rotations while I was in school, I got to meet and work with some therapists in Portland that were just really psyched on chronic pain. And they even had this intensive chronic pain management program where I was at. And so people would come in for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. And so they'd have an hour PT, hour of OT, hour with their psychologist. They'd have some time with their physician, some group therapy. And when we all sat down the first day, sat around in a circle, and these people were just really messed up. They all had their dark sunglasses on, shoulders were up to their ears, and the lead therapist introduced himself and said, "This is what we're going to be doing." And the goal of this program is not to get rid of your pain. You are going to continue to have your pain, and we are just going to help you to basically deal with that and function more within your life. And I'm sure that that helped a lot of people. But at the time, I just thought, wow, that is like one of the most depressing, disheartening things I have heard. Is this where we're at with this? And I was kind of discouraged by that. And then fast forward to my last clinical rotation, it was kind of out in the middle of nowhere, Eastern Oregon, real small town, small rural hospital, mostly outpatient. And I get there and meet my clinical instructor, and she's like ready to give birth any second. And I was like, I was thinking, how is this going to work? And sure enough, like a week later, she's off on maternity leave, and the department head comes up to me and says, "Hey, Mike, I know this is a sticky situation, but do you think you can take her patients for us?" And I was like, "I don't really know exactly what I'm doing yet, And he's like, "Nah, no, you'll be fine. I'm around if you have questions. We've got other therapists here." So I was like, "All right." And it just so happened that there was a traveling therapist there at the time who had taken a bunch of John's classes, and he was doing some stuff that was like, voodoo. I didn't really understand what was happening. And I mean, I remember there was this one old guy who had a knee replacement, and he was just doing terrible months after it. He couldn't hardly walk. And this guy did like a suboccipital release on him, and he just like took off and was doing great after that. So I kind of hung around with him, and he showed me some stuff. And at the time, this is crazy to think about now, but I was like 24, 25, and I had this left-sided abdominal pain for over 2 years, and I never felt it during the day. It was only happening at night. It would wake me up like clockwork, like every 2 hours. So I would get up 3 times every night for over 2 years. And I told this guy about it, and I had, we went over red flags and stuff in school, and I kind of was freaking out about it a little bit. And I had gone to get it checked out. Nobody could find anything. So I told this guy about it, and he did these two techniques on me for like less than 10 minutes. And one was like kind of a cross hand release with like his index fingers. They were super, super subtle techniques. And he brought on my pain, which I had never felt during the day. So I actually had him stop at one point. And that night was the first night in 2 years that I slept through the night. And so that was super powerful for me. And then he showed me how to help myself, some things to do on my own. And so I kind of took it from there. And then fast forward to after I graduated, I started working for a traveling healthcare company. And one of my last rotations, I ended up working with a therapist who had also taken a bunch of John's classes, and she'd been a PT forever. And she was kind of the go-to person when people didn't really know what to do with their patients, or like chiropractors would call her after they crack a person and the person wouldn't be doing, real well. And, he'd kind of call her in a panic and say, "Hey, can you help me out with this?" And so she showed me a lot too. And I thought, I got to take some of these classes. And so I signed up for them to go for after the last contract. And on the last day of that contract, the owner of the clinic comes up to me, and he's a great guy. He actually went to the same school John did, and he had been practicing for a long, long, long time, and had like 5 clinics up and down the coast, and just a really good business person. I really respected him a lot. And he pulls me aside the last day, and he says, "Mike, I heard you're thinking about taking some of these John Barnes classes." And I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about it. He just kind of looks at me. He's like, "Mike, you need to steer clear of those folks." And I was like, well, now I have to take them. I got to see what this is about. That's a pretty serious statement to me. So right after that, I went to Sedona, and I took the vacation series. So 1, 2, and Unwinding. And it was just, mind blowing. What John was talking about was like the polar opposite of what I had heard in that intensive chronic pain management program deal before. And a lot of it just really resonated with me. And I really appreciated how he turned up the heat real slowly through that period. In the beginning, he was talking about the anatomy, and he threw out a couple different books. I remember that The Body Electric was the first one I picked up and read, written by an orthopedic surgeon. And I think it helped my channel 5 side to kind of get on board, and like, okay, there's something behind this. And then of course, how it is, like, over that time period of 11 days, it's like this barrage of just mind-blowing experiences, and that, I kind of changed my life. And I ended up moving to Bishop for another travel contract after that, and just really loved it here. And that was 19 years ago now. So it was really, really pretty life changing for me.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can resonate with so many chapters of with the story that you just told. First thing that comes to mind for me is something that John has taught us, and that is without awareness, there's no choice. And so I think a lot of times we'll go through life accepting the status quo from what we learn from society or school or our mentors or teachers or whomever. And that often can be limiting. And so something that you had mentioned was you had this rotation at a chronic, like hospital setting feeling where people were just told like, hey, we're not going to help you fully heal from this. We're just going to help you manage it, And something that kind of strikes me deeply is I feel like the state of our healthcare isn't about healthcare. It's about sick care. And it's just about how long you can keep someone, slightly getting better, but not really overcoming what they're dealing with. And that is, I think, part of capitalism. And with myofascial release, what we've learned is, hey, you can heal from these things. And you had shared this really wonderful story of how you had this left abdominal pain for 2 years, not knowing what that was. And just a simple technique of a modified cross hands release or cross fingers release helped you actually feel that for the first time in the day and what you could do to manage or heal from it. And I think a lot of times we get told these things like, oh, someone so and so has this condition, so they're never going to get better. And especially when you're talking to the patient, I feel like that's so disheartening for someone to feel lost in their own healthcare, to be vulnerable enough to ask somebody else for help, and for that person just to say, hey, we can't help you, and you're kind of going to be dealing with this for the rest of your life. Now, I think those experiences paved the way because I think when you did get introduced to myofascial release, one, your business person that you respected was like, steer clear of this. And for some reason, I think those of us in myofascial release, when we hear that, we're like, what are we steering clear of? I'm actually more curious. And I remember the first time I had brought up to my old boss, like, hey, I was wanting to learn myofascial release from this John Barnes character. He had a similar reaction where it's like, oh, I don't know about this guy. Kind of looks like a hippie. If you want to take myofascial release, these are the people that I would recommend, but don't take it from this guy. And I'm like, for some reason, I am way more curious about this John Barnes guy. And so, I think for us, when we hear that, we kind of are curious as to what is so bad about it that people have this negative reaction. And then it's not until you have your own experience. I think that's something that's very different with myofascial release, at least in my experience, versus other continuing education courses where typically, because we're physical therapists, there's a lot of didactic work in terms of, hey, we're going to learn the theory or the physiology or the anatomy. And yes, that is important. And I think John starts off with that because obviously you don't just like rip the band-aid off super quick. I think you had said, there's kind of this gradual increase of the heat. But as you go through MFR1 to unwinding and then MFR2, you start to feel things differently. And that I think becomes a very important distinction from myofascial release to anything else, because it's once you feel the difference that you have that experience. Something that John says is a lot of people are stuck in channel 5, and what he's trying to teach us is to be more in channel 3. And just as a reminder, if you're new to this podcast, the two channels you can think of like the two hemispheres of your brain, where channel 5 is more of like your left brain. It's your linear, logical, rational side, and it's also where fear is thought to be. It's also very critical, impulsive, and that is where a lot of us as adults tend to operate from. Whereas channel three, you can think of more of like your right brain. It's your intuitive, creative, playful side, and it's where love is thought to be. And typically, you could see kids living in channel three, just playing and not having these fears that we adopt as we grow older. And so, as you feel what it feels like to be in channel three, and you are now aware of what channel five is, now you have a choice. You can either choose to do the same things you've always done, which often leads down a path of fear, or you can choose to be more mystical about it, believe in things that you can't necessarily see. And I'll say I'm at a chapter in my life where I feel like when there's just an opportunity for the mystical thing, that I'm more curious about it. Not to say that it's all there, there I think there is a lot of snake oils and stuff that get sold. But with myofascial release, I've been able to adopt it slowly as a physical therapist. And so, I think when you share your story, what I hear is, man, you went through this whole process of channel five to channel three. Did you have any fears around adopting myofascial release? Or once you took your first vacation seminar series, you're like, this is for me. I'm doing this. I'm going all in.
You know, I think I had a good situation, kind of a unique situation, and I was working for this traveling company, so I would sign 3 or 6 month contracts where I would go, and I didn't really have to worry about that so much. As far as, I knew I was just going to be there temporarily, so I felt like I could kind of do things the way that I wanted to do them, which was kind of nice. When people get a traveling, or when companies get a traveling therapist in, they kind of need a warm body at least, and so they're pretty open to things. And actually, the clinic that I started working in when I moved to Bishop was great. And the supervisor just kind of let me run with whatever I wanted to do and however I wanted to treat. So I didn't have to worry about keeping my job, or turning people off. And I guess, I think after those first couple of classes, I was just fully on board, and I just knew that it helped a lot of people. And it was interesting. I think even before I took those classes, I can remember like sitting with some of these patients and just knowing that like there's something I can do to help this person, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. Or I can even remember thinking of techniques that turned out to be techniques that you would teach. You have this intuitive sense a lot of times of like, okay, this thing, I don't quite have it dialed in, but I think this would be really helpful. But at the time, it's like I didn't really know, there wasn't a name for it, and I hadn't been taught that in school. So it was like, that's kind of crazy. I'm not going to do that. And then it turns out like that's kind of how it goes. It's like a lot of these things, if you're centered, just come up, and you just have an intuitive sense of how to treat these folks. So it all kind of worked out for me as far as the clinic that I was in, and just having a real supportive supervisor and staff, I think. And I was able to kind of show them some things, and they seemed to be into it. So it worked out real well for me.
That's awesome to hear that you were in an environment that was very adopting of the techniques and allowed you to be your own therapist. Did you ever have any performance anxiety of like, man, I just learned this. I don't know if I'm doing it correctly, or did you just kind of intuitively know what to do and follow that?
Oh no, definitely performance anxiety for sure. One of the most important things, or the things that I kind of grasped from John, obviously there's like hundreds of things. It seems like we all get from him. But he made a comment one time. I think, we were all sitting, and people were raising their hand and talking, and the theme was kind of this performance anxiety. And after a while, he says, you don't don't worry about trusting yourself right now. You don't have to trust yourself. Just trust the work. And it works, and just use the principles and just go with that. And eventually, you'll start to trust yourself more. And so that really kind of stuck with me, so whenever I would start to have performance anxiety, I would try to keep the idea in mind that, like, this is bigger than me. This is kind of try to get my ego out of the way and just let things happen. And that seemed to be really helpful.
And something that you had mentioned is like being able to trust your intuition or like follow what you are intuitively kind of knowing.
Mhm.
Now, as I think a man, especially as a physical therapist, we go through like, hey, you got to learn the specific order in which things are done. Have you always been intuitive, or how did you go about fostering your intuitive abilities?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, through school, that kind of put me down the more logical road of maybe not paying as much attention to my intuition. And I think I got the good basic building blocks through school, and I enjoyed that process too. But just taking John's class, and I think that really helped to me to switch things over and have a much better balance. And it's helped not just with work, just throughout my life, kind of in general. And that's one of the reasons why I started the clinic was just this idea that I could think outside the box, and talking to all the folks in the classes. There was a lot of them who were starting their own practices, who had been practicing, and doing a private practice for a long period of time. And I had never even considered that growing up, or when I went to PT school, or even out of school. But I think just having the idea that it's possible, and you don't need like a 5,000 square foot space to do things in. You can keep low overhead and just keep things real simple, and have it be about between you and the patient. That really helped just to kind of broaden me a bit.
I love that. And I think that's very important. And I think that's a very wise words to say, because I think oftentimes we have these grandiose ideas of like, oh, I'm going to have this 5,000 square foot space and I'm going to treat this, that, and the other. When really you should try to keep a low overhead. And then it is just about you and the patient being able to connect with them and help them. Because again, it is a very vulnerable place to be in, to trust somebody with your health. And as long as your mindset is framed around that, I think everything else will work itself out. Now, I think it's very cool that you had your experience. I think for me, it was a little different. I remember taking my first seminar series, and something that can happen is called an unwinding, where it's this involuntary movement that I think you described as looking a little bit voodoo-like. And the first time you see it, I thought I was like, yo, it looks like they're having an exorcism on the stage. So when you see that, first of all, don't judge it if that's possible. If you do find yourself judging it, like many of us do, I would try to feel in deeper as to why is seeing this rubbing me the wrong way, right? And trying to do that inner work to see what it is, because it is authentic healing, even though it's something we've never seen before. And I think that there can be fears around, man, if this happens, what are people going to think of me? Or this fear of judgment, things like that. And for me, I was fortunate to have some people unwind during my first seminars. And I was like, is this real? Because I was like, I'm barely doing anything. I'm following what John is saying, being centered, being aware, present, and intentional with everything that I'm doing. And this weird reaction would happen. And I'm feeling pretty good about myself. Like, hey, I'm doing this correctly. And I remember trying to do that on my own with my own patients. And I was like, people already know me for doing physical therapy in the way that I'm doing it, and I'm getting good results. So why should I change what I'm doing if what I'm doing is already good? The whole like, don't fix something if it's not broken. But then I was going through a chapter of my life where I took a home health job. And this home health job, I was working with primarily Vietnamese speaking patients. And even though I'm Vietnamese, my Vietnamese is terrible. Like it's like an elementary level like language to me. And so without me being able to describe what it is that I needed them to understand, or what I thought that they needed to understand, in English because they wouldn't understand. I just did the work because in John's work, you want to stay quiet and that allows you to be more aware. And things would happen. And, and I'm like, okay, normally people will unwind when I take these seminars and I'm doing this on this patient and then nothing is happening. So then, of course, my channel 5 kicks in. I was like, man, am I doing this right? Normally people will unwind, but this is nothing's happening. And that is normal. I think when you first start, you're going to have this performance anxiety. But if you can adopt whether it's John's wisdom or Mike's wisdom and now my wisdom of, hey, this is bigger than you. And as long as you're following the principles, trust that it will work. And then you'll build more trust in yourself and confidence with yourself as you have more experience, just like anything else. It just takes practice. And so even though in my early days, when no one was unwinding on the table, when they got up, they would say, man, it felt like you were barely touching me, but it felt so deeply inside of me. And I was able to feel better almost instantaneously. When my last therapist that I worked with, it really hurt a lot and I barely could do anything. And now I can raise my arm above my head or drive a car. And so it goes to show that I think as long as you're staying centered and present, and you're able to let go of your ego, which I think can get in the way, being known for something or holding that into high stature, and it really just being, hey, this work can help somebody. And if as long as I'm centered and present and intentional, then I'm following the principles of myofascial release. I'm not forcing or leading, and something will happen, right? And it's that ability to let go of the certainty of expecting things to follow, let's say, a protocol, which in my opinion typically doesn't even work. That there's this inner wisdom that you can follow, and it's your intuition. And so you've been able to learn how to do this. And I think you started your own practice because you could see that could be done. Whereas I think in physical therapy, especially, you do these rotations and you're like, wow, I'm treating 3 to 4 patients at a time and I'm getting burnt out. Like, this is not going to last. And you were like, you know what? I want to start my own practice. I've spoken with other people who have started their own practices and they seem to be doing well. That is a possibility for me. And then in addition to that, you had said, I was able to let go of my ego. And I think that that is something that we talk about a lot in our sport. Mike is also a rock climber. I'm a rock climber. And that's something that we can find some common ground with. Have you found that myofascial release has helped with your rock climbing or that your rock climbing has helped with your myofascial release?
That's an interesting question. I think they fit real well together. One of the main things I love about climbing is that it's one of the only things that I've done where you're just in the moment the whole time, and I think that that's just an incredible feeling. So I think that really carries over with MFR to when you're in a session and just being able to kind of bring yourself back, when your mind starts to kind of float away and knowing what that feeling is of actually being in the moment. And that's why the classes are so incredible too, I think, and why, just like retaking classes, I think is amazing with MFR too, because it never gets old. I never go to a class, no matter which one it is, if I've taken it before and have it be like stale. There's always it's always just these kind of mind-blowing experiences. And I think that's the important part, is like to continue. It's like part of the practice. It's not like this event that happens where it's like, oh, now I'm totally centered and all the time. And it's like a kind of a continual practice, that continual journey that you're on.
Absolutely. I think to learn the principles is one thing, but to apply them is a totally different thing. And if you're doing myofascial release or you feel drawn to this work, it affects every facet of your life. And I think when you repeat them as a different version you are than when you first took them. And so I just repeated unwinding for the third time, and different things resonated with me, and I took different lessons out of it. And so just like you said, repeating allows you to feel this centeredness again that is normal for us to be in, I think, at birth or when we're kids, But when we're adults, you have responsibilities and obligations, and that tends to fill this space. And so it's always a good reminder to feel what that feels like, but also to learn the different lessons that will be downloaded because you're in a different chapter of life. And I do very much agree that rock climbing and myofascial release are almost synergistic because John teaches us to be very centered and present. And when you're climbing, because there's this risk of falling or this danger, that you will be very present. And something that John tries to teach us is to be in this witness or observer position. You're not your thoughts, but can you be in a position where you can observe your thoughts? And when you're climbing, especially like for me, a discipline of rock climbing that I like is called sport climbing. And that's where you will climb with the rope and then you'll put these quick draws on to put your rope through. But there's this increased fear for me when I start climbing above a bolt to clip the next quick draw because the channel 5 fears are like, man, if I fall, I'm going to fall double the distance. And then I'll start over gripping, and versus just being like, okay, if I could just stay present and focus on the climb, then that is all I need to worry about. Right. And then that dichotomy of like, what are you scared of and what can happen versus if you're just present and focused on the climb, what does that feel like? I can hear my thoughts coming up, but do I let that grab onto me and I succumb to the fear and then give into that or let go or do anything of that nature? And just like myofascial release, where it's like, it's a very gentle hands-on technique. John will say, imagine and feel like you're putting your hands in clay, and I think a lot of times, especially if we are manual therapists in other disciplines, it's more aggressive and that can cause the patient to guard or brace, and that takes away from the work. And just like in rock climbing, when you're over gripping because you're scared, you waste a lot of energy, and what I'm reminded as of is in unwinding, I had taken repeated in San Antonio, which Donna had taught this time. And shout out Donna, she did a phenomenal job of teaching. I could definitely see John's essence being taught through that, and she just did a wonderful job. But I had come across a myofascial release therapist who was like, it was always been one of my dreams to be able to kind of climb these things. And I was like, yeah, we could knock that out today. Like I was like, yeah, let's go to a bouldering gym. It was Armadillo Boulders in San Antonio, and let's just climb some things and see what it feels like. And you could see that because they're brand new, like if a hold felt insecure, they would grip on harder. But as long as I was there, just coach them because I think a lot of times people will think climbing is like about finger strength or how upper body strength is involved. But really, a lot of it is footwork. And so if you could just like find the right feet, you don't have to hang on your arms as hard. And as long as I was just telling them like, hey, find some high feet, find some high feet, they could manage their way up the boulder. And obviously it wasn't the most efficient because they were brand new, but they were able to overcome this fear that they had that we all have, And so whether that's work or life or business, myofascial release, or rock climbing, I think it's always a good reminder to stay centered and to stay present. And for those of y'all who are interested in rock climbing, I think that it's a perfect example of what it feels like. So if you're like, man, I don't know what it feels like to be present or centered because my mind is always racing in all these different directions and I have a million thoughts, I would highly recommend rock climbing because when you have that insecure feeling of like, oh, am I gonna fall? You are dialed in. You are in that present moment. Otherwise, you might hurt yourself. So I think that it has very much been a parallel with me and whether that's myofascial release or rock climbing or even relationships and business, the channel 3 mindset carries through all facets. Now, on that note, I know that you're a father and a husband. How would you say that myofascial release has expanded even into your family life?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, it's helped me in so many ways. I think first, one real clear way is just starting my practice. So I ended up working for the hospital here for about 5 years, and Throughout the last two, things just kind of started to go downhill as far as like, I just clearly, me and the clinic, we just weren't a good fit anymore, not to the fault of anybody really, but, and because of going to these classes and meeting all these people. I know Aaron LeBauer had a lot of, I've heard you mention him, and he had a lot of good information too. That that just gave me the kind of kickstart to start to really plan on like I plan my escape, because it's not like I couldn't have stayed there, I could have stayed there, but I see these folks walking around the hospital, a couple of them who clearly didn't want to be there, and they've been there for 25 years, but they're stuck because of the pension or benefits and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be that person. So that allowed me to make the jump and have my start my clinic, which was challenging, but fast forward to having kids, it's like there's so much freedom as far as being able to make your own schedule, and now I can really set them and my family as being priority. And if soccer season, if they need to coach or ref, or I can do that, or I can go to all their field trips or different events and stuff. And so that part's been real helpful for me. But then on another side, just kind of getting in tune with like my upbringing and my relationship with my parents, and how does that carry over to my relationship with my kids, and kind of gaining better awareness of like what is the relationship I want to have with my kids, not just now, but down the road, and what kinds of things do I want to teach them. So there's that aspect of it. And then also like just being able to show them what MFR is and treat them periodically. And also have my wife be, my wife has gone to MFR1 with me, and we did the women's health class as well, so that was really special, I think, to be able to share this part of me with them as well.
I love that. And, you said that you're at this job that you kind of saw the writing on the wall. You said, we weren't a good fit together and it just happened to be a product of the circumstance. Did
Mm-hmm.
you have any thoughts of like, man, but I have to stay here because it's what's paying the bills? Or once you made a decision, you're like, okay, I'm out of here.
you know I mean, part of it is I didn't have kids at the time, and I wasn't married. My wife was my girlfriend at the time, so you could say I had less responsibility, and I was a little bit more open to it. But it was one of those things where there are just some things that you can't not do, that come up. And I'm sure people don't do those things periodically, but you get that feeling where there's no fight against it, there's no struggle. It's just like this is something that has to be done, because you can see even what, how things are going to be probably in the next 5 or 10 years, and it's not going to be a good road that you're on. And I think just, again, going to the classes, talking to all these folks just gave me the confidence that I needed. And, we talked about kind of how things were taught in school. I had a business class in school, but they did the thing where you write the business plan, and you got to have the 5,000 square foot place, and you got to have all this equipment, and then you're going to have, all these employees. And it's like this crazy, overwhelming thing that I just kind of shoved that out of my brain. But, really, it's like I need a table, and I need my phone to talk to people, when they call, and I, schedule them, and I need to do a little bit of paperwork, and then that's really it. I need like 150 square feet, and so that all made it seem very manageable and allowed me to jump out and try it. And then also to think about like contingencies and what are the different avenues and different populations of people that I might be able to reach out to. Things are slower than I want, and just kind of get a bit of a plan together. But it made it a lot easier, and made me feel more confident that I could do it.
Yes. Awesome. I think that paints a clear picture of what's possible and what it looks like in the beginning. I think a lot of times, yes, I had a business class in PT school, and you got to do all these numbers and huge facility and all that's got to make it work. But I think when I'm actually at this point where I've started my own practice, you can take a lot of those overwhelming, especially when it's those big numbers, like, oh, commercial real estate's like whatever, $6,000, $7,000 a month. And I'm like, dude, that's a ton of money.
Yeah.
versus I know when I started, I just made house calls. So I didn't even have to deal with the overhead, you know? And now I'm at a place where I rent my own room. So it's like you can build slowly. And something you said, it took longer than you would have liked. It's going to do that. I think God gives us a vision and he doesn't tell us how to get there, because if you knew what it took to get there, you wouldn't do it. When I took unwinding for the third time, one of my biggest lessons that I got reminded is to have patience. And it's not having this grip on like, this is the outcome that I want and I need it right now. It's like, hey, if I'm building a practice, something that I plan on doing for at least the next 20 years, it might take some time in the beginning. And that's okay. I think it's when people have this idea like, oh, I started this myofascial release practice, I've taken these courses, and I'm supposed to have a thriving practice after a year. Not to say that it doesn't happen, it could definitely happen, but that hasn't been my experience. It's taken me years to even understand what I was doing, to become the person that I needed to become to have a successful myofascial release practice. And that takes time. And so I think your story is similar. And I think it paints a picture for those of us who are fearful of starting, of thinking, man, it has to be this other thing. It can be what you want it to be. And I think an important thing that you have mentioned is it's not about, well, not directly mentioned, but when you talk about myofascial release, it's not about the money. It's not saying, oh, I can make this amount of money. And I think most business owners, or at least the successful ones, they don't chase the money. What they actually chase is freedom. You want to have the freedom to create your own schedule. You want to have the freedom to, hey, my kids need me. If they need a referee, or I need to be a good dad and all these things, I want to have the freedom to make that decision. And if you're working for somebody else and you're seeing, 20 patients a day or even more, you're going to be burnt out by the end of the day. You're not going to have that energy for your family, for your kids, or whomever, because your job is literally sucking all of that away from you. And so I think that is an important reminder for us when we're starting, that we can forget. I think the number one priority needs to be your patient care. Obviously, we're in this work. I think we're drawn to whether it be physical therapy or massage therapy to help somebody else. But on the back end of that, yeah, you want to be able to create a successful business, but not just to say that you generated X amount of money, but it's to say, hey, I have been able to help for me, it's my girlfriend in the time that she's needed me. Or for you, it's like, I am there for my wife or my kids when they need me. And I think a lot of times people will lose sight of that and they'll create this business that becomes a machine that you feed into. Versus, I think you very clearly defined, hey, this business that I'm creating needs to feed me and the family that I'm here to serve. And I love that you said that. Now, another thing that we get to do is, if you're lucky, you get to bring your partner into these circles, whether it's your wife or your kids. And you had mentioned that your wife attended MFR1 with you, and then she's even done women's health with you. Can you tell us about what that experience was like? You had described it as being special. What made it so special?
I think probably the big thing is like, I'm sure you know how it is. Like when you go to classes and then you're trying to tell somebody who has never been to the classes what it's like you can't really describe that in the way that they get it. It's one of those things where you can get it on a logical level, but not, you can't get it on an internal visceral level, until you actually see it and experience it. So I think that got kind of old for me real quick, just trying to explain this to people and just being so excited about it. And just recognizing that there's just no way I can put that in words. You just got to put people in the room with you. So I think that was probably the the best thing about it.
And did your wife take onto it as quickly as you did, or is there any resistance there?
That's an interesting question. I don't remember. I don't think we talked about there being resistance. I think I had just talked about it so much, and so she knew some things to expect, I think. And so that kind of made her a little bit more open to it. And then yeah, I think she was just open, thankfully, and enjoyed the experience. Yeah.
Okay. I love that you were able to enjoy that experience with your, especially women's health. I've taken that with Yvette, my
Yeah.
partner, and she was open definitely by the end of it, but I don't know that it was as gradual or as accepting. I think for her, it kind of cut against the grain, which I can understand because when I was first introduced to myofascial release, it cut against the grain. But I'm always curious how other, whether it be couples or practitioners who invite their counterparts to these seminars, how it gets received. It sounds like because you had been so open about it and she knew how important this was to you that she just was able to share in that. Is that
Yeah. It was just going to be an adventure. I think I had made that very clear. And like you said, she knew how important it was to me. And so she was just on board, and we had a great experience.
I love to hear that, and I wish that my experience with Yvette was the same. But hey, I think this is another reminder that John teaches us is to detach from the outcome. I think for me, I remember taking her to healing seminar as
Yeah.
like, all right, let's get your feet wet. This is a huge part of what I do. And when she first saw someone unwind on the stage, which was very early on in the seminar, she was like, "Give me the keys. I'm out of here." And I had to be like, "Okay, I can't force you to do this. Here are the keys," and it gave
Yeah.
her that sense that she was in control. And good on her. She stayed through the whole seminar. And by the end of the seminar, she actually told me because I was expressing to her, like, I would like to take women's health with her. And at the end of healing seminar, she's like, you know what? If you want to take women's health together, let's do it. And I was like, oh man, that's huge. That's huge.
That's amazing, because that is a big deal. And the fact that she made that jump just within days, is pretty incredible. Because I can remember that first series that I took. By the time we got to the end, I remember thinking, if we would have if this stuff would have happened on the first day or two, like, I would have ran screaming from this room and never come back. But that progression that they create, I think, is super helpful, just to keep people open. you know
Absolutely. I think all of the instructors, John especially, hold space for all of us. And I know that when I go to a seminar, especially when it's taught by John, it feels different. I almost feel like he is masterfully using the energy and cultivating all of our energy and thrusting his into it so that it's this very sacred healing space. And yeah, like I think even when Yvette saw John for the first time, she's like, man, he's got this aura about him. He's
yeah.
like off on stage and all that stuff. And I think just to goes to show because especially in women's health, I can't really empathize because I'm not a woman, but I know that there's different things that women have to go through or have gone through. And for me, it's being able to hold space for Yvette as she's kind of learning and releasing these things, which, sometimes can feel good and sometimes it can agitate you. And she stayed through it all, and so I'm glad to hear that you're able to share that with your wife. And, if you are at your relationship where you're a myofascial release therapist and your counterpart wants to join, I think that's a huge moment, even though it might not feel like that in when it happens. But I think when I hear you say, that's huge for her to have been accepting of the work only after a few days or a handful of days, and then be willing to sign up for women's health, which is like it can be a lot.
Yeah,
Um, that
sure.
that shows a lot of growth within her own self. And I'll say that, you know, is typically someone who didn't unwind because I think she's not really good at letting go of control, like many of us. And at the very end of healing seminar, she had this small unwinding, and her arm like moved to the side. I was like, "Oh, it's happening! It's happening!" And then she, was able to have her own experience at Women's Health, and some unwindings happened there. Hopefully, I'll get to interview her on this podcast so that she can share her side. I don't want to speak for her, but it was a very sacred moment, I would say, if I had to describe it. So, that being said, before we wrap up this podcast, is there any last thing you would like to share with our audience?
I guess two quick things. One thing that you had mentioned, just kind of this idea that MFR is not really or a lot of times it's not really an instant gratification thing. It's like you kind of mentioned that sometimes it feels like nothing's happening, but then, they'll get up and say what they felt. But, and my experience a lot of times is that I don't even get that feedback that day. They'll come back the next time and be like, I have to be honest, I didn't think you were really doing anything. And I went home and, slept for 4 hours, or, I got really sore for, the next 12 hours. But like now then the next day I felt really great, or I felt like this happened. So I think that's kind of an important concept to get of like, it's good to just get rid of the expectations. Like you're not going to necessarily see the change happen immediately. I think that's always been helpful for me. And then I've heard you mention some books on the show. I really enjoyed Carol Davis's book and Richard Hardy's book. Both of those were great, I thought. And then I just wanted to mention, you picked up Kathy Koval's book. She wrote, I'm not sure when she wrote it, probably a while ago. It's like Feel Your Way Through. That book I think is really special too. So I just want to throw that out there as a recommendation. I really recommend that to a lot of patients, a lot of folks, and just really love that one.
And don't forget this book, Beyond Tape, written by yours truly, Mike Gable. It's helped me out a lot. I would throw your book in that list, but thank you for sharing those recommendations. Before we get out of here, I just want to ask, how do people find you?
So my website's easternsierraphysicaltherapy.com, and my email address is on there, so you can reach out, contact me. I'm on Facebook and Instagram a bit too, but probably the easiest way would be just shoot me an email if you have questions or anything.
Awesome. Well, Mike, I just want to thank you again for being open and honest with us, sharing your story. I could resonate with different chapters of your life and see how it mirrors with mine. And I just want to thank you again for taking the time to be a guest on this podcast.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me, Unu. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Myofascial Health. I help myofascial therapists create beautiful websites for their MFR practices, even if they aren't tech savvy. If you're just starting your MFR practice, or you're an experienced MFR practice owner, learn more about how I can help at www.myofascial.health/website.